The Cairo sky thrummed with the sound of celebration in October of 1981. From his grandstand, President Anwar Sadat watched with paternal pride as a military parade marked the anniversary of his nation's greatest victory. Fighter jets sliced through the air in silver flashes, while below, a river of steel tanks and soldiers marching in perfect synchronicity flowed past him. Suddenly, a single military truck broke formation, lurching to a violent halt directly before the presidential tribune. Uniformed men leapt from the vehicle, their movements not for show, but for assassination. In that instant, the man who dared to make peace with his people's historical enemy was about to pay the ultimate price. The president who had commanded this army was now its target. A storm of machine gun fire tore through the pageantry, replacing cheers with chaos, blood, and screams. How could a leader, a man from the Egyptian countryside who had ascended to absolute power, be struck down by his own soldiers? What had driven him to commit what many saw as an unforgivable act, clasping the hand of the enemy in peace? The answers lay buried in a life of ambition, conflict, and conviction. To understand the forces that converged on that violent day, one must return to the beginning, to the quiet origins of the man himself. Anwar al-Sadat's journey began not in the halls of power, but in a humble village along the Nile at the end of the year 1910. The sun beat down on the village of Mit Abu al-Kum, a place of clay houses and biting poverty baked into the Nile Delta. For a young Anwar al-Sadat, life was a daily struggle, shared with three brothers under the roof of a father whose meager army salary could scarcely feed them. This personal hardship was a mirror of a national humiliation. Egypt was a land under British dominion, its pride as choked as its economy. Sadat grew up in the shadow of foreign power, the sight of British soldiers humiliating his countrymen a searing memory. He witnessed the casual brutality on the streets and saw the immense wealth of the Nile siphoned away to London. The feeling that took root in him was not simple anger. It was a pure, unyielding hatred. It was at school that this feeling began to find a direction. A teacher ignited his imagination with tales of heroes who had dared to defy empires. He spoke of Muhammad Ahmad, the Mahdi of Sudan, and of Gandhi's peaceful resistance in India. But it was the story of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk that truly set the young Sadat's mind ablaze. Here was a man who had forged a modern nation from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, who had expelled invaders and restored dignity to his people. The path was now clear. Sadat would be a soldier, and he would be a revolutionary. Upon entering the military academy, he discovered he was not alone. He found a brotherhood of young officers who all burned with the same visceral hatred for the British. Among them was a charismatic and calculating lieutenant named Gamal Abdel Nasser, who held a stark vision for the future. Only a military revolution, he argued, could ever truly liberate Egypt. Together, they formed a secret society known as the Free Officers. But Sadat was impulsive, his desire for action too immediate for Nasser's patient plotting. As World War II engulfed the region and Egypt served as a critical British base, Sadat saw an opportunity. He pursued a dangerous alliance with Germany, operating on the brutal logic that the enemy of his enemy could be a friend. If the Axis powers could drive the British from Egypt, the risk seemed worth it. His gamble failed. British intelligence uncovered the plot, and Sadat was arrested. He endured 2 years in prison, facing degrading conditions and violent interrogations, but the experience did not break him. It forged him into something harder, more radical, and more determined than ever. When the war ended and he was finally released, he found an Egypt still suffocating under British control. Worse still, the nation was saddled with a corrupt monarchy, led by a King Farouk who seemed to serve only his own pleasures and his English masters. Sadat plunged back into the world of conspiracy, but this time his actions were more extreme. He took part in the assassination of Amin Osman Pasha, an Egyptian politician widely seen as a British collaborator. He was sent to prison again, this time for murder and conspiracy. On a hot July night in 1952, the low rumble of engines filled the streets of Cairo. The tanks rolling through the capital were not British, but Egyptian, commanded by Nasser and the free officers. The coup Sadat had dreamed of for years was finally happening, and he was at the very center of the storm. King Farouk, deeply unpopular, was deposed without a fight and fled aboard his luxury yacht. The monarchy was finished. Egypt, at last, belonged to the Egyptians. But the question of leadership remained. Nasser was the true power, but he understood the need for a facade. He installed General Mohammed Naguib as a nominal president, while Sadat operated quietly in the background, consolidating the new regime, editing newspapers, and proving his unwavering loyalty. Eventually, Nasser tired of the theater. He removed Naguib and seized power directly, becoming the undisputed leader of Egypt and a rising icon of Arab nationalism. Through it all, Sadat remained in the shadows, serving as vice president, advisor, and friend. When Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, defying Britain and France and surviving the ensuing war, Sadat was at his side. He was Nasser's number two, a man defined by his fidelity, patiently waiting for his turn. In the immense shadow cast by Gamal Abdel Nasser, Anwar Sadat was a figure of quiet patience. To be the second man in Egypt was to be an afterthought, a minor star orbiting a brilliant, all-consuming sun. Then, in the summer of 1967, came the catastrophe. In just 6 days, Israeli forces shattered the combined Arab armies, their jets annihilating the Egyptian Air Force before it could even lift from the tarmac. The Sinai, Gaza, the Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem all fell under occupation. A broken Nasser offered his resignation to the nation, but the streets of Cairo erupted, a sea of voices begging him to remain. Through it all, Sadat remained loyal, a silent observer, etching the profound humiliation into his memory. A debt, he knew, would one day have to be paid. 3 years later, in September of 1970, the heart of the Arab world seemed to stop. Nasser was dead from a sudden heart attack at just 52 years old. As millions wept in the streets, the quiet vice president, Anwar Sadat, assumed the presidency. To the true power brokers in Cairo, he was a transitional figure, a puppet whose strings they would soon control. They were profoundly mistaken. Sadat inherited a nation on its knees, its land occupied, its army demoralized, its economy in ruins, a mere pawn in the great chess game between superpowers. But Sadat was not Nasser, nor did he wish to be. His first act was to turn inward. In a swift and brutal purge he called the corrective revolution, he dismantled the network of Nasser's old guard who had plotted against him, consolidating his grip on power. Now he truly ruled. His next move sent shockwaves from Moscow to Washington. With a single decree, he expelled some 20,000 Soviet military advisors from Egypt. The world had underestimated him, seeing a man dependent on Soviet patronage. He showed them a leader standing on his own. From this new position of strength, Sadat began to plan the unthinkable, a war against Israel. This would not be a war of annihilation. That, he knew, was impossible. It would be a limited strategic conflict designed to reclaim the Sinai, restore honor to his soldiers, and force the world to the negotiating table. In secret, he forged an alliance with Syria's Hafez al-Assad, planning a simultaneous two-front assault. Egypt would strike across the Suez, while Syria descended upon the Golan Heights. The element of surprise was everything. They chose a date of profound significance, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the most sacred day in the Jewish calendar. Israel, they gambled, would be at prayer. On the afternoon of October 6, 1973, the silence over the Suez was shattered. 2,000 Egyptian cannons opened fire in unison, unleashing the largest artillery barrage since the Second World War. Under the thunderous curtain of fire, Egyptian commandos in inflatable boats swarmed across the canal. They turned high-pressure water cannons against the massive sand ramparts of the Bar-Lev line, Israel's supposedly impenetrable defense, washing them away into the water. Within hours, thousands of Egyptian soldiers were on the other side, their flags fluttering defiantly over the sands of the Sinai. Israel was caught in a state of total shock. Its troops were scattered, its tanks in maintenance, its soldiers home with their families. As Syria simultaneously crashed against the Golan Heights, the state of Israel was fighting for its very survival. For days, the impossible continued. Egyptian anti-tank missiles bled the Israeli armor, while their anti-aircraft batteries clawed jets from the sky. But then came a fatal error. Pressured by his Syrian allies, Sadat ordered his armored divisions to advance beyond the protective umbrella of their missile defenses. Exposed on the open sands, the Egyptian tanks were decimated by the Israeli Air Force. Seizing the momentum, Israeli forces counterattacked, punched across the canal, and encircled Egypt's Third Army. The war that had begun with such stunning success was now turning into a desperate struggle. A United Nations ceasefire brought the fighting to an end. On the battlefield, Israel could claim a tactical victory, but strategically, the triumph belonged to Sadat. He had proven that the Egyptian soldier could fight, that the Suez could be crossed, and that Israel was not invincible. The stain of 1967 was, at last, partially cleansed. Sadat emerged a hero, the pride of the Arab world restored. But he no longer wanted war. He now sought a victory far more difficult to achieve, and was willing to do the unthinkable to get it. The air over Cairo was thick with the ghosts of failure. 4 wars waged against Israel had left behind a bitter legacy. Tens of thousands dead, a fortune in treasure spent on arms, and an economy in ruins. For all the blood and sacrifice, Egypt had nothing to show but occupied land and a deeper well of hatred. From this despair, President Anwar Sadat made a decision that would rupture the course of history. He began sending secret messages to Jerusalem, carrying an offer that was both treasonous and visionary. He was willing to negotiate directly, face to face, with no intermediaries to soften the blow. In Israel, the overture was met with deep suspicion. Prime Minister Menachem Begin, a former underground fighter, could only see the outline of a trap. No Arab leader had ever acknowledged his country's right to exist, let alone offered to visit its capital. But it was no trick. In November of 1977, Sadat boarded a plane bound for enemy territory, an act of almost unimaginable courage. As the aircraft descended, a tense silence fell over the world watching on television. At the foot of the stairs, Begin waited. The two adversaries, architects of war, stood face to face. When Sadat extended his hand and Begin grasped it, the Middle East was irrevocably changed. The Arab world, however, exploded in a firestorm of fury. Syria broke relations, Libya decried him as a traitor, and Iraq demanded Egypt's expulsion from the Arab League. Unmoved, Sadat addressed the Israeli parliament in Arabic, his voice steady. He spoke not of war, but of an end to bloodshed. He spoke of a homeland for the Palestinians and security for the Israelis. Begin listened, disagreeing with much, but hearing him nonetheless. The gesture unlocked a door, leading to 13 days of brutal secret negotiations mediated by President Jimmy Carter in the mountains of Maryland. Locked away at Camp David, the talks nearly collapsed amid screams and exhausted standoffs. Just as all seemed lost, an agreement was hammered out. Israel would return the Sinai Peninsula, and Egypt would formally recognize the Jewish state. For this, Sadat and Begin would share the Nobel Peace Prize. But the cost at home was immense. Egypt was cast out of the Arab League, and Sadat became a pariah. He was certain he was building a better future for his people, but he was wrong about one thing. he would not live to see it. 8 years to the day after he had launched the Yom Kippur War, on October 6, 1981, Sadat presided over a military parade in Cairo. Under the glare of an October sun, Cairo was a city consumed by national pride. A vast military parade unfolded, a spectacle of power designed to celebrate Egypt's strength, with jets tearing across the sky and tanks rumbling past cheering crowds. From the Tribune of Honor, President Anwar Sadat watched, flanked by his Vice President Hosni Mubarak, and surrounded by generals, diplomats, and the international press. The procession moved with flawless precision until a single artillery truck broke from the column. Its sudden halt felt like a discordant note in a perfect symphony. The doors flew open. 4 men in military uniforms leaped out, AK-47s in hand, grenades hanging from their necks. As they charged the stand, Sadat rose, his posture straight and proud. He mistook the assassins for an unscheduled part of the ceremony, a dramatic flourish from his own loyal soldiers. The lead attacker, Lieutenant Khalid Islambouli, raised his weapon, his voice cutting through the air. "I have killed the Pharaoh." A storm of automatic fire erupted, shredding the air and tearing into the presidential stand. In an instant, celebration turned to slaughter. Sadat was struck in the neck, the chest, and arms, his body riddled with bullets as Mubarak was wounded in the hand. The assassins continued their assault, hurling grenades as presidential security, caught by surprise, finally returned fire. Rushed to a military hospital, doctors fought a desperate losing battle against his devastating wounds. But the loss of blood was too great, his vital organs perforated beyond repair. By late afternoon, Anwar Sadat was declared dead. He was 62 years old, a man who had made peace with Israel and reshaped the Middle East, only to be murdered by soldiers from his own army. The assassins were members of Al-Jihad, an Islamic fundamentalist organization that saw Sadat not as a peacemaker, but as an apostate. To them, his treaty with Israel, his repression of religious groups, and his alliance with the West were unforgivable betrayals of Islam. Lieutenant Islambouli had infiltrated the parade, chosen his men, and waited for the perfect moment to strike down the president who dared to challenge decades of hatred. At his trial, Islambouli offered no repentance, insisting he had slain an enemy of his faith and would do it all again. In the cold light of the courtroom, the assassin's voice was clear and without regret. Khalid Islambouli declared he had killed an enemy of Islam and, given the chance, would do it all over again. Months later, he and his co-conspirators were executed, but their ideology would not die with them. Sadat's funeral was a stark and lonely affair, a testament to his isolation. As his casket was carried through the streets of Cairo, the absence of Arab leaders was a deafening silence. Only 3 attended. Across the Middle East, many did not mourn. They celebrated. The man who had gambled everything on peace was abandoned by the very people he sought to save from the endless cycle of war. His successor, Hosni Mubarak, who had survived the hail of bullets, would rule Egypt for the next 30 years, dutifully maintaining the agreements Sadat had forged. Egypt kept the Sinai Peninsula and was spared the devastation of another major conflict. Yet beyond its borders, the region continued to burn. The Palestinian question remained unresolved, and the flames of radicalism only grew higher, feeding on the very grievances Sadat had tried to address. In the years that followed, 2 starkly different legacies took shape. In Iran, streets were named in honor of Khalid Islambouli, his photograph held up as a symbol of resistance. Meanwhile, in Cairo, Sadat's tomb receives few visitors, a quiet monument to a peace the world seems to have forgotten. His final words, lost in the thunder of gunfire, remain a mystery. He fell believing he had chosen the right path, paying for that conviction with his life. His story stands as a brutal testament that the pursuit of peace can demand not weakness, but the most resolute and terrifying form of courage.